Hello, and thank you for joining us for this Richard Caister talk, which have had to move online because of the restrictions placed on public gatherings because of the coronavirus pandemic. Um, before we came online, we were able to get one talk done in person, which was delivered by Sally Ann Lomas. But she has kindly agreed to meet with me to record that talk so we can have a full collection online. Sally Ann Lomas is a producer who's worked with the BBC, including the search for the lost manuscript, a piece on Julian of Norwich. She's also the CEO of Cloth of Kindness and also chair of the trustees of the Friend of Julian of Norwich group. So Sally, it's fantastic that you're able to be with us, and thank you very much for giving your time in this way. And the talk is entitled A Day in the Life of Medieval Norwich, and Sally's going to be giving us an imaginary day of what it was like in Norwich during the time of Richard Caister. So thank you, Sally, and over to you.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Richard. Alex, that's not a very good start, is it? Thank you very much, Alex. Let's give this a go in this new world that we live in. So, I was very honoured to be asked to give the first of these Caister talks. It's such an exciting programme of scholarship and spiritual exploration, which I'm sure everyone will find inspiring, informative and spiritually challenging. But I should warn you that I want you to think of me as a sort of warm-up act to prepare you for the heavy weights that are going to come, because as Alex has said, I'm neither a scholar nor a theologian. I'm a documentary filmmaker. So what I hope to do this evening is paint a picture of the world in which Richard Caister lived and worked by describing a day in the life of an imaginary Christian woman in 1411. Now, while I hope not to stray too far from historical truth, this is a piece of fiction. So I'm telling you a story. Now, not long ago, I was walking down the south bank of the River Thames, just across from the Tower of London, passing the new glass shell of City Hall. I love that view along the river, such a pleasing mix of old and new architecture. I found myself thinking about my imaginary Christian woman from 1411. If she were transported on a time machine to walk beside me, what would she make of the spectacle of towering glass and giant steel structures? How much would she recognise, and how much would be totally alien? Much has changed with the harnessing of electricity and by new uses of material like glass and steel, but much would be still understandable. Brick buildings, boats, bridges, different styles, but similar functions. And people don't change much. Same frowning or smiling faces, all the needs of life, shelter, clothing, food, drink, entertainment, companionship, compassion, care for mind and body. These remain the same despite the 600 years that separate us. So perhaps our world would be more recognisable to my medieval companion than I'd at first imagined. Maybe, in the light of eternity, or in the light of the 30 billion years since the Big Bang, 600 years is, well, less than 5 minutes in a human lifespan. If we now whisper the magic words and travel backwards in time, back past the last millennium and the fireworks over Norwich Castle, back through 2 world wars and the bombs dropping on Norwich, back through the turmoil of the Industrial Revolution, back through the Napoleonic Wars, the English Civil War, back through the Reformation, to find ourselves in the early morning dark of February the 19th, 1411. Maybe we'll be surprised to find ourselves feeling quite at home. The date, as I've said, is 19th of February, 1411, a Thursday. But in the Middle Ages, dates were reckoned according to the Julian calendar, a Roman inheritance, which by this time was around 9 days out of sync with the solar calendar, to which our current system holds with greater precision. So in terms of daylight hours, this date was the equivalent of our 28th of February. But even in the space of a day, time was reckoned differently in 1411. According to a system known as seasonal or unequal hours, the day lasted from sunrise to sunset and had 12 hours regardless of its actual length. So an hour could last anything from 40 minutes to 90 minutes in our reckoning, depending on how much light there was in the day. So in our terms, on the 19th of February, the dawn arrived in Norwich at 6:11 a.m. The Britain Arms house at the top of Elm Hill was built in 1347 and was known as Ye God's house. As the first February light penetrates the gloom of this half timber and thatched structure, rising from the slumber is the heroine of our story, Elizabeth Sporrell. And could we have picture number 1, please, Alex? So we can imagine that Elizabeth Sporrell would look something like this. This is actually a pious Dutch lady, but the outfit would be very similar. So Elizabeth is a pious lady in her 40s, widow of a prosperous merchant, Geoffrey Sporrell. Her bed is surrounded by heavy drapes to protect her against drafts. She sleeps wearing one of her only 2 sets of linen underclothes, which she changes just once a week on a Sunday. Pulling aside the drapes, the bedroom is cold and gloomy, with just one narrow, unglazed window. And as the maid Agnes opens the shutters, in comes a stream of early morning light and a fierce and bitter February breeze. One of those nasty northeasterlies straight from northern Norway that we sometimes get in Norwich in the winter. Hastily, Elizabeth climbs into her only set of outer clothes and washes her hands and face in the basin of warm water that Agnes has brought her. She then heads downstairs to the main living room, where Agnes has stirred the fire, banked up overnight, into a vigorous blaze. Now the church bells ring. We need a sound effect here of bells ringing. So the bells ring out for the first prayer of the day, Matins, immediately followed by Lauds. Time is measured out by church bells and follows the Christian daily pattern of eight prayers, known quite simply as the hours. With 46 parish churches and 4 friaries plus the cathedral, there'd be no chance of anyone sleeping in. Certainly the bells of St. Peter Hungate, to which the Elm Hill house has direct access, would be enough to wake the household. And there were also the bells of the Dominican friary or Blackfriars immediately next door. Only monks and nuns actually got up in the middle of the night to say matins. Everyone else said matins with Lauds as the first prayers of the day at dawn. Now Elizabeth is a pious Christian, and she shares the house with 4 other devout ladies of independent income, who together pursue lives of prayer and good works, yet without having taken any formal vows. Isabel, Anne, Cecily, plus Elizabeth's only surviving daughter, Margaret. Elizabeth also has a son, Geoffrey Jr., who, as captain on a merchant ship, is away for much of the time, leaving Elizabeth to keep an eye on the family business. She gave birth to 2 other children, but one died as an infant and the other as a young child. Infant and childhood mortality was appallingly high. Around 17% of babies would die before their first birthday, and around 25% would have succumbed by their 4th. So most married women will have lost young children and known the devastating sorrow that this brings. So together the ladies of the household, with their servant Agnes, recite in Latin the service of Matins, followed by Lauds. Should I have had the picture of the Book of Hours? Maybe we should put that up. Oh no, it's over the page. Yeah, let's put that up now. Okay. Ave Maria, gratia plena, Dominus tectum. Hail Mary, full of grace, our Lord is with thee. Even the laity would recite the service in Latin, even though most wouldn't understand exactly what they were saying. So here we can see the Book of Hours in Latin with an English translation. Probably the household has at least 1 Book of Hours to follow, possibly more than 1. As they are ladies of independent means, they would likely have a small library of some 4 or 5 books. Books of hours were by far the most commonly owned book. All books were precious and treasured, as they had to be hand-copied. Often they were bequeathed in wills as prized possessions. Although knowing no Latin beyond her daily prayers, Elizabeth can read and write in English and do basic bookkeeping, qualities prized in a merchant's wife. She may have been taught by the nuns at Carrow Road, and now passes on her skills to her daughter and the other ladies, that's Carrow Road Convent, and now passes on her skills to her daughter and the other ladies. Literacy at this point was growing among the middle classes, with possibly as high as 40% of the population literate in English. And although women were less likely to be able to read than men, a growing number could. Matins and lauds last roughly 25 to 30 minutes, with the ladies reciting the words together, but taking it in turn to call out their responses. Now, although most people at this time would consider themselves Christian, this was because being Christian was socially expected, the norm rather than the exception. But the number of regular churchgoers was not as plentiful as one would expect from the number of churches. To be a Christian, all that was expected of you was to be baptized and say confession once a year on Ash Wednesday, and to go to church once a year on Easter Sunday. So by no means all Christians were spiritually active, and there would no doubt be some who privately were totally skeptical. But the atmosphere was prevailingly Christian, unlike today, and to live a devout life was admired and respected in 1411. Elizabeth and her housemates have dedicated their lives to God. They live a life similar to the communities of Beguines found in the Low Countries, lay women living together and devoting themselves to God and good works. There were thought to be several such communities in Norwich, but not found anywhere else in England. Prayers over, the practical business of the morning is to be dealt with. No breakfast, except maybe a heel of bread dipped in wine. Household chores are shared. There's water to be fetched from a communal pump, chickens to be fed, eggs to be collected, the herb garden watered, decisions to be made about the day's chores and about what to have for lunch, because they're expecting a special guest. They also discuss what charitable activities are priority for the day ahead. 7:15 a.m. and the bell rings for prime. 5 minutes of prayer said together, and then Elizabeth is out with her basket on her way to Norwich Market. Can we have image number 3, please? So this is a print of Norwich in 1723, but it gives us some idea of what the city would have looked like back in 1411. In the 14th and early 15th centuries in England, Norwich was second only to London in terms of prosperity and population, which, although it fluctuated, was just short of about 10,000 people. Now that may seem small to modern eyes, nothing more than a little town, but in the Middle Ages, this was a teeming metropolis. But it's pretty safe to assume that many of the permanent inhabitants knew each other fairly well, at least by sight, and that it was a close-knit community. But it was also outward-facing. Norwich was an unusually well-connected city because of the rivers Yare and Wensum, used to transport goods and people out to the North Sea, and from there to other parts of England, and, most importantly, to the Low Countries, present-day Holland, Belgium, Luxembourg, and parts of the northeastern France. At that point in time, the main trading and banking hub of all of Northern Europe. So although 2 outbreaks of plague in the early 14th century had reduced Norwich's population by 1/3, population numbers quickly recovered. By 1377, Norwich was more or less back to normal. Undoubtedly, this was due to immigration from the countryside rather than from natural reproduction. There were higher wages to be had from fetching and carrying for merchants in Norwich than from working the fields for manorial lords. In the long term, The plague proved beneficial for the survivors. The considerable reduction of the workforce meant that labourers could demand much higher wages. This in turn led to a greater circulation of capital, and in Norwich, as across Europe, much of the 15th century was a period of prosperity and opportunity. By then, land was readily available, wages high, and serfdom virtually abolished. So I think we have to imagine Norwich as a prosperous and thriving city. So could we have the image of the map of Norwich? So here's a map of Norwich in 1541, but I think you can see in the centre there, the market and the Guildhall are marked. So they're round about there, more or less where it is. So the market was situated more or less where it is today. And Elizabeth walks, as we do today, amongst stalls, selling fruit and veg and second-hand clothing and all kinds of foodstuffs: olive oil, rice, almonds, dried fruit, rye, garlic, vinegar, cumin, aniseed, licorice, salt, wine, candles, wax, paper. Not just essential items, but luxuries also. Norwich was described by one contemporary as a city of dandies, as the inhabitants were some of the first to import the European fashion of wearing doublets. Elizabeth can't help but glance, a little startled by a young man with a rakish European air striding about in a tight-fitting doublet. Could we see image number 5, which is actually a rather gruesome picture of the beheading of the innocent Count Dirk Boots. But if we point to the young man at the background there, can you, that's very good here. Now he's wearing a very fine doublet there of Italian style. And you can quite see how even a pious widow would have had her head turned by a young man strutting about dressed like this. So today, thanks largely to Alan Partridge, outsiders think of Norwich as a sleepy, rather backward city. But in 1411, it was cosmopolitan, hip to the newest ideas and fashions, with people from all over Europe visiting. It was a really exciting place to be. On this fresh February morning, Elizabeth enjoys her brisk walk around the market, stopping to chat to friends and exchanging banter with the stall holders. There were at least 300 people in Norwich directly employed in religious life, so there would have been far more evidence of religious figures amongst the population, with parish priests and visiting preachers out in the market. Elizabeth, an active Christian, would be well acquainted with many of them. But her first stop is the fish stall. She's buying fresh fish for Friday's meal, since it's a fast day. But dinner today is rabbit, so a coney has to be bought. These were bred in East Anglia, where warrens were plentiful. So the meat is cheap, but meat is still a treat. She also purchases bread, onions, prunes, raisins, pepper and cinnamon for a special meal, and ginger for a medicinal drink. Now, sadly, she's caught short at the market and has to go to the public toilet at the Guildhall, which is in a shocking state. She's one of a number of citizens who make complaints, and later the city expends some considerable effort on renovating the public facilities, we're glad to hear, between 1411 and 1412. Folk in 1411 were of necessity far more down to earth and less prudish than we are about the basics of life, because very few people had a private toilet or privy. Now, rather like today, the construction industry was flourishing, with new buildings or renovations everywhere. The Guildhall was finished in 1412, so as Elizabeth passed by, it would already have been clearly recognisable as the building we know. So her shopping is completed as bells ring out for prayers for terce at 9:15, and Elizabeth pops in to St Stephen's to say the office, where she bumps into the good vicar of St Stephen's, Richard Caister, and reminds him that he's joining the ladies for dinner later that day, dinner being the medieval term for what we'd call lunch. So back home, Elizabeth, with her maid Agnes's assistance, prepares dinner. And can we have a look at a recipe from the time? So here's a medieval recipe. So even in 1411, people were writing down their favourite recipes and sharing them. And it's good to see that the celebrity chef has got a long history. So rabbit cooked in beer with prunes and raisins, flavoured with cinnamon, pepper and thyme, served up with bread. Sounds pretty good, doesn't it? The smell floats through the house and the fire has warmed and cheered the living room. That glorious lemon bright February light is shining on the cobbled streets outside. The recipe Elizabeth follows counts time by prayers, boil vigorously, stirring for the time it takes to say 5 Hail Marys. 11:15 a.m. and Richard Caister arrives, and they all sit down to eat their main meal of the day. There's no conversation. Just as in a convent, they eat in silence, while someone reads from a devotional text. Today, Cecily reads from one of their most precious books, a handmade copy of the short text of the Revelations of Divine Love, written by Norwich's famous anchoress, Mother Julian. Let's see the image of Julian from the cathedral. Here we go. So Julian of Norwich has written about the mystical visions she received directly from God while she believed she was dying. How inspiring it is to Elizabeth and her community to hear Julian's words, "Just because I am a woman, must I not talk of the goodness of God?" I read Julian's book 600 years later and was inspired to become a Christian. So I can only imagine how amazing it must have been for Elizabeth and her companions. They would know Julian, be able to talk to her, and to be reading from her book at a time when it was unheard of for women to write books and to have their own ideas about God. That must have been a really thrilling experience. 3 days ago, on February the 16th, was St. Juliana's Day, and it's to celebrate Julian's namesake saint that they're rereading Julian's book. It was Richard Caister who brought them Julian's manuscript to copy, as he's a great supporter of Julian's mystical wisdom and has been encouraging her to write down her theology. He also encourages Elizabeth and her companions in their spiritual pursuits and energetic activities amongst the poor. 12 noon, and it's time for sext, and Caister leads the ladies in prayer. Afterwards, Caister and the ladies have much to talk about. Margaret, Elizabeth's daughter, is training as a midwife. Saint Margaret was the patron saint of childbirth. And midwives are required to administer emergency baptisms, which could be done even if only one limb of the baby had emerged. With such a high incidence of infant death, baptism at birth was essential for a Christian world that believed in eternal damnation for the unbaptized. Caister is preparing Margaret for her upcoming examination by a member of the cathedral chapter, and he helps her understand the finer points of the medieval baptism ritual, including what sounds gruesome, the crucial triple exorcism. They also gossip gently about a local celebrity, another East Anglian mystic, Marjorie Kemp from Lynn. She's famous for her prodigious displays of piety, for travelling far and wide dressed always in white, for confronting bishops and bursting into frequent tears as she's moved by the Spirit. She's persuaded her husband to agree to a celibate marriage and leaves him and her 14 children behind as she goes off on pilgrimage through Britain and Europe, and even as far as Jerusalem. Elizabeth regards Marjorie with some scepticism, finding her displays of piety rather showy for a Christian woman. She much prefers Mother Julian's quiet and modest way. But at the same time, she's a little envious of Marjorie's courage and spirit of adventure, daring to travel so far and wide. Elizabeth dreams of a pilgrimage to Jerusalem, but would never be brave enough to do it. She's never travelled further than an hour's drive from Norwich. She hasn't even visited the shrine at Walsingham. Now, Richard Caister is a big fan of Marjorie Kemp, and he robustly defends her. He believes Marjorie has a genuine and passionate faith and reminds the ladies that there are many different paths to God. So, If we could see the image of Chaucer's, we all know about pilgrimage from Chaucer's Tales. And we can see that pilgrimage was a medieval pastime, a very popular medieval pastime. But of course, not every traveller was genuinely inspired by religious fervour. Many just like the opportunity to see a bit of the world and have a good time. But Caister does believe that Marjorie Kemp's pilgrimages were religiously inspired. So after dinner, Elizabeth accompanies Caister to visit the Great Hospital. So can we have the image of the Great Hospital as it is today? There we see it. So Elizabeth helps to rebandage some of the inmates' wounds and brews up a drink using dried coriander to help soothe the fever, and another of mint and lemon balm for respiratory problems. Devout women like Elizabeth and her companions did vital work amongst the poor and sick. There was no public health provision in 1411, and without religious charity, the poor would have no access to healthcare. The Great Hospital still offers a refuge to Christians without much money. Having recently run sewing workshops there as part of a Cloth of Kindness project, I was impressed by the atmosphere of love and kindness. And I like to think that Elizabeth and her women friends and Richard Caister were instrumental in initiating the sense of active compassion that has endured through the intervening 600 years. 2:45 p.m. and the bells ring for none. That's N-O-N-E, which is the next prayers of the day. Elizabeth sneaks into St. Helen's, the Great Hospital Church, to say her office together with a group of inmates. From the hospital, Elizabeth makes her way along the riverbank. She wants to find out if there's any news of her son's ship returning. She's always anxious while he's away. With the 100 Years' War still raging between France and England, trading ships are vulnerable to attack. The riverbank is teeming with activity. As roads are generally in bad condition and unsafe, most goods travel by water. Norwich's reputation for manufacturing fine worsted cloth has brought considerable prosperity. There's also trade in dyes, woad and madder, in building materials, iron from Sweden, timber from the Baltic, oak for casks. Boats are quickly offloaded and reloaded. A boat in dock is expensive. I once filmed the turnaround on a British Airways jet from Heathrow to Denver. Once the plane had landed in Denver and passengers were unloaded, hundreds of workers swarmed onto the plane, cleaning and sorting baggage, checking engineering, refueling. The plane was clean, refueled, new passengers on board and ready to fly in less than half an hour. I was astonished at all this behind-the-scenes activity. And I imagine that the boats Elizabeth saw at the Norwich docks to be also swarming with activity. Shipwrights, sailmakers, labourers and customs officers. Labour was cheap and plentiful, so time in dock would be kept to the absolute minimum. You know, they'd be turning the ships around just like we nowadays turn around BA flights. So there's no news of Geoffrey's ship. So Elizabeth wanders up to King Street from the river and calls in at the anchorage of Mother Julian next to St. Julian's Church. She's pleased to find no one else waiting at the window on the street that connects to Julian's cell. Elizabeth calls out to see if Mother Julian is able to talk. Her luck's in and Julian joins her at the window. They talk of Elizabeth's daughter Margaret's coming examination for her midwifery training and her son Geoffrey's longer than expected absence. Julian encourages Elizabeth to put her faith in God's love and assures her that all will be well. As always, after seeing Mother Julian, Elizabeth leaves feeling comforted and strongly aware of God's presence. Julian has reminded her that she is enfolded in God's love as closely as the skin holds the body. Elizabeth meets up with her sisters in religion to go to a sermon in the Carmelite church at Whitefriars, where the Jarrell's print works are now, given by William Southfield. Being a friar, it's his job to preach in public. His subject today is the life and works of Saint Juliana. A Christian convert, Juliana refuses to marry a pagan thereby incurring the wrath of her pagan father and pagan suitor. She was imprisoned, tortured, and beheaded. St. Juliana was traditionally invoked for the safe delivery of women in labour and for protection from fever and contagious diseases. So she'd be very handy just now. So she would have been of great importance to Elizabeth and Margaret. Gory tales of Christian martyrdom and women refusing to be forced into unpleasant marriages were very popular with religious women at the time. Elizabeth attends many public sermons. This is the main way her religious knowledge grows, with her access to books being so limited. The ladies are home in time for Vespers at 5:30 p.m, followed by a light supper of bread and cheese. By then the sun is setting and the candles give only a dim light, so at this time of year there's little opportunity for sewing or reading. The ladies talk quietly, reflecting on the day, sharing news and reporting back on needs amongst the sick and poor. They then say Compline at 6:30, and as Agnes the maid banks up the fire for the night, Elizabeth and her companions retire to bed. Now, when I set out to explore the life of a Christian in 1411, I didn't expect to feel envious of her day, but strangely I do. To live in a place teeming with religious activity and to feel as a woman the right to be able to participate actively must have been thrilling. Elizabeth had two living examples of women living locally, Mother Julian and Marjorie Kemp, who had direct mystical experience of the presence of God, and she could actually talk to them. She also had at least one local vicar in Richard Caister, who was truly encouraging and inspirational, and she probably also had access to a wide range of educated religious scholars, expanding her spiritual knowledge. She was living in a prosperous international city, alive with new religious ideas. Sure, I wouldn't like the cold, dark houses and communal toilets. Probably similar to those I've experienced at music festivals, not very nice. Though I have to say that filming recently in South Africa last month, I met people living today in conditions very much worse than Elizabeth Sporrell or even her maid Agnes would have faced. So while not envying the lack of plumbing and electricity in 1411, the thought of no mobile phones, no television and no cars seems very attractive. I also think that the pattern of having the bells ring out to pray the hours would be a gift to my life. To be called to awareness for 5 minutes every hour, I think would be a great practice of mindfulness, and even for non-Christians could create moments of breath in a busy day, and I'm sure would benefit our collective mental health. Having spent time living with Elizabeth Sporrell over the last few months, I think that I could very much enjoy getting to know her better, and I'd hope that we could be friends despite the 600 years that separate us. I hope you've enjoyed your time with her and that this immersion into the everyday medieval life of a woman not so very different from us will prove a nourishing and supportive ground for the lectures to come. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Sally Ann, for that. That was fascinating. The way that you weave together historical detail and the elements of imagination gives us such a vivid picture, and of the rhythms of daily life, and just the sort of knowledge that Richard Caister would have known. And as you say, it provides a perfect foundation for later talks. So thank you ever so much, and thank you for being willing to record the talk with us like this. So thank you, Sally Ann.
Pleasure.